report hit the mahogany desk on a Tuesday evening, and Kang Taehyun didn't look up from it for 4 minutes straight. His inner circle was still talking. Logistics, shipment routes, territorial disputes, the cold, digital language of an empire built on precision and fear. Taehyun had presided over 1,000 of these war councils. He could navigate the strategy in his sleep, but for 4 minutes, 4 full minutes, he heard none of it. The image on the desk was a standard surveillance still. A woman caught in a downpour outside a rival district, completely unaware of the lens. She wasn't running for cover. She was just standing there, her head bowed, her violin case clutched to her chest like a shield. The rain around her was a blur of fractured light and gray slate. She looked like someone who had finally run out of places to hide from her own heart. Taehyun set the report down on the desk carefully, the way you set down something that might shatter. Who is she? The room went dead silent. His head of operations cleared his throat, shifting uneasily. An American, sir. A musician. She was seen loitering near the Lee Syndicate's perimeter during the Tuesday skirmish. We suspect she might be a... I didn't ask what you suspect she is. Taehyun's voice was a low blade. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. I asked who she is. None of the men in that room had heard Taehyun ask about a person that way before, not once in the 13 years since he'd taken the mantle. They exchanged glances that lasted less than a heartbeat, the kind of look that recognizes a shift in the wind without needing a word. Find out everything, Taehyun said quietly, and bring her to me. He said it the way he said everything, final, absolute, and dangerous. But his hand, hidden beneath the edge of the desk and invisible to every soldier in that room, was not completely still. His fingers had tightened around nothing, just for a second, as if trying to catch a drop of rain. He was 32 years old. He had inherited a throne of blood at 19. He had never once in those years allowed himself to want something that wasn't a strategic asset, until right now. And he didn't even know her name yet. Alina Brooks arrived in Seoul with a violin case, a single suitcase, and a grief she was pretending was manageable. Her father had died 3 months earlier, leaving behind a mountain of debt and a legacy of secrets she couldn't afford to keep. So she did what she always did when the world got too loud inside her own head. She left it behind. Seoul was supposed to be a transaction, 21 days, one performance contract, a way to clear the ledgers and go home. No complications, no looking back. But the night before she boarded her flight, she had found an old ledger tucked into the lining of her father's trunk. Inside was a list of dates and a name written in his hurried script, Kang. Beside it was a faded photograph of her father as a young man, standing in a Seoul alleyway with a man whose eyes were as cold as winter, both of them looking like they were guarding a grave. She kept the photo. She told herself she was just curious. She told herself she would look into it if she had time between rehearsals. She had no idea that Seoul was where she would finally stop running, and that the man in the rain was already waiting to catch her. If you're watching this and already hooked, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and drop a like. Comment below the time and where you're watching from. I love seeing how far this story reaches. The rain in Seoul didn't just fall. It claimed the city, turning the neon glow of Gangnam into a smeared, impressionistic painting of electric blues and violent pinks. Alina Brooks stood on a corner that felt like the edge of the world, her violin case held against her chest with a white-knuckled grip that had become her only constant. The instrument was heavy, a dead weight of wood and memory that she had carried across an ocean, and for the first time in 3 months, she felt the urge to simply let it drop into the rising gutter water. She had been in the city for less than 6 hours, and already the air felt too thick to breathe. The humidity clung to her skin, mixing with the dampness of a dress that had seen better days, the silk slipping off her shoulder as she shivered. She was supposed to be at a rehearsal hall 3 blocks away, but the directions on her phone had died along with the battery, leaving her stranded in a district where the buildings looked like fortresses, and the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father's face, not as he was in the old photograph she'd found, but as he was at the end, frail, surrounded by hospital monitors and the suffocating silence of things left unsaid. He had spent his life running, and now she was doing the same, pretending that a performance contract in a foreign capital was a career move rather than an escape. The tears came then, hot and traitorous, spilling over her cheeks to be washed away instantly by the downpour. She didn't try to stop them. There was a certain mercy in the rain. It allowed her to fall apart in public without anyone noticing. She leaned her forehead against the cold glass of a closed storefront, her shoulders shaking, her breath hitching in a way that sounded like a plea for a ghost to answer. She didn't hear the cars stop. She didn't notice the sudden, heavy silence that descended on the street as 3 black sedans idled at the curb, their engines a low, predatory hum. Across the street, inside the lead car, Kang Taehyun watched the world through tinted glass. He was midway through a conversation about a disrupted supply line in the northern docks, his mind a steel trap of numbers and names. His men were talking, their voices a familiar drone of tactical analysis, but Taehyun's gaze had snagged on a shape in the gray light of the sidewalk. A woman. She looked like a ghost that had been caught in a storm. Her hair, long and dark, was plastered to her back, and her white dress was a stark, fragile contrast to the blackened brick of the alleyway behind her. But it was the way she was crying that stopped the air in his lungs. It wasn't the loud, performative grief of the people he usually dealt with. It was a quiet, soul-deep fracturing. "Sir, the Lee Syndicate's movements near the perimeter suggest." Taehyun didn't hear the rest. He was watching her fingers tighten around the handle of a worn instrument case. He saw her chin tremble as she looked up at the sky, her eyes wide and glassy with a sorrow so profound it felt like a physical weight against his own chest. In a world of calculation and cold iron, she was an impossible variable, something soft, something hurting, something that didn't belong in the shadow of his name. "Stop the car," he said. The command was quiet, but it cut through the cabin like a blade. "Sir, we're in a high-risk zone. We shouldn't linger." Taehyun didn't wait for the door to be opened for him. He stepped out into the deluge, the rain instantly slicking back his dark hair and soaking through his bespoke suit. He didn't care. He walked toward her with the slow, deliberate stride of a man who owned the pavement beneath his feet. Alina didn't see him until he was inches away. She gasped, flinching back against the glass, her eyes darting to the visible ink of the tattoo that crawled up the side of his neck, disappearing beneath his jawline. He looked dangerous, sharp-featured and cold, an apex predator standing in the middle of a storm. But then he reached out. He didn't touch her face, not yet. He simply stood there, his massive frame blocking the wind and the brunt of the rain, creating a small, dry sanctuary for her in the chaos. He looked down at her, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her heart hammer against her ribs. He saw the grief she was trying to hide, and for the first time in 15 years, Taehyun felt a crack in the armor he had spent a lifetime forging. "You're shaking," he said. His voice was a low, melodic vibration that seemed to settle the frantic rhythm of her pulse. I'm lost," she whispered, her voice breaking. Taehyun looked at the violin case, then back at the woman who looked like she was one breath away from shattering. He reached down and took the case from her hand, not with force, but with a strange, careful reverence. His other hand settled firmly on her waist, pulling her flush against him, shielding her shoulder where the dress had slipped. The contact was electric. He was warm, solid, and smelled of expensive tobacco and rain. Alina leaned into him instinctively, her forehead resting against the damp silk of his shirt, the tears finally slowing as the sheer power of his presence overwhelmed her fear. Taehyun looked over her head at the darkened windows of the buildings surrounding them. He knew the Lee Syndicate was watching. He knew that by stepping out of that car, he had made her a target, but as his hand tightened protectively around her, he realized he didn't care about the risk. He had spent his life building an empire of fear, but looking at the woman in his arms, he realized he finally knew what it was like to have something he was actually afraid to lose. "You aren't lost anymore," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "I have you." He turned, guiding her toward the idling sedan. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, and didn't know that her father was the man who had nearly destroyed his family 30 years ago. All he knew was that the rain had brought him the only thing he had ever truly wanted for himself, and he was never going to let her go back into the storm alone. The interior of the sedan was a silent, pressurized vault that smelled of expensive leather and the ozone of the fatting storm. Alina sat huddled against the door, the oversized wool coat Taehyun had draped over her shoulders feeling like a heavy, protective shell. Beside her, Taehyun remained a silhouette of absolute stillness, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window as the city blurred into a smear of neon light. He didn't speak, but his presence was a physical weight, a gravitational pull that made the air in the car feel thick and charged. The vehicle didn't take her back to her hotel. Instead, it carved a path through the winding, uphill roads toward the secluded heights of Seongbukdong, where the city's noise died away and was replaced by the looming shadows of high stone walls and iron gates. "Where are we going?" Alina's voice was small, a fragile thread in the silence. "My things are at the guest house. My violin. Your instrument is safe," Taehyun said, his voice a low, calming vibration. He finally turned his head, his dark eyes catching the flicker of a passing streetlight. "And your things have already been moved. From this moment, the guest house no longer exists for you." Before she could protest, the car glided through a massive gate that opened like the mouth of a fortress. They pulled into a courtyard of polished stone, where several men in dark suits stood waiting with the rigid posture of soldiers. One of them stepped forward, a man younger than Taehyun, with a face that held a trace of warmth that the others lacked. "Everything is prepared, brother," the man said, bowing slightly as Taehyun stepped out of the car and reached back to hand Alina out. Taehyun didn't let go of her hand. His grip was firm, a silent declaration of ownership that Alina was too exhausted to fight. He led her into the foyer of a house that felt less like a home and more like a sanctuary of glass and shadow. The ceilings were impossibly high, and the silence was so profound it felt intentional. "This is Minyu," Taehyun said, gesturing to the younger man who had met them. "He will ensure you have what you need. You are not to leave this estate without my express permission. Do you understand?" Alina looked from the cold, magnificent expanse of the house back to the man who had pulled her from the rain. "You're keeping me here, under what grounds?" "Under the grounds that your life became a currency the moment you stood on that street corner," Taehyun replied. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, his sharp features illuminated by the dim chandelier light. "The Lee Syndicate saw me take you. In their world, that makes you the most efficient way to hurt me. You are a vulnerability I cannot afford to leave unguarded." He signaled to Minyu, who stepped forward with a respectful nod. "Miss Brooks, if you'll follow me, your room is ready. Your father's belongings and your violin have already been placed inside." The mention of her father made Alina's heart skip. She watched Taehyun walk away toward a set of heavy double doors, returning to the world of ledgers and blood she knew nothing about. She followed Minyu up a wide staircase, her damp shoes silent on the silk runners. The room they reached was vast, overlooking the fractured lights of the valley below. On the mahogany desk sat her violin case and her father's worn leather trunk. Seeing them there in this cold and alien palace brought a fresh wave of vertigo. "Why is he doing this?" Alina asked, turning to Minyu. "He doesn't even know me." Minyu paused at the door, a complicated expression crossing his face. It was the look of someone who had seen a machine suddenly develop a heartbeat and didn't know how to explain the malfunction. "My brother has spent 15 years calculating risks, Miss Brooks. He doesn't do anything without a reason. But for the first time, I think the reason is something even he hasn't admitted to himself yet." He bowed and closed the door, the soft click of the lock echoing through the room. Left alone, Alina walked to the window. The rain had stopped, leaving the city below shimmering like a field of fallen stars. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the faded photograph of her father and the man with the winter-cold eyes. She looked at the image, then back at the door where Taehyun had disappeared. She had come to Seoul to find answers about a dead man's past, but as she watched a black sedan peel away from the gates below, she realized she was now part of a living man's present. Taehyun had ordered her brought to him to protect his empire, but as she touched the silk sheets of her new cage, she wondered if the person he was truly trying to protect was the man who had forgotten how to want anything for himself. Outside, the wind picked up, whispering through the pines that guarded the estate. The relocation was complete. Alina Brooks was no longer a ghost in the rain. She was the secret held at the heart of the Kang dynasty, and the war for her had only just begun. The following morning, the estate emerged from the mist like a titan carved from obsidian and glass. Alina awoke to a room flooded with a pale, surgical light that made the silk sheets beneath her feel almost too smooth to be real. For a moment she lay still, waiting for the familiar, comforting hum of a New York morning or the cramped, dusty smell of her father's apartment. Instead, there was only a profound, heavy silence, the kind of silence that had to be bought and paid for. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the manicured grounds. Far below, men in dark suits moved with the synchronized grace of a private army, their presence a constant reminder that this was not a home, but a headquarters. On the chair by the door, she found her things. They had been cleaned, pressed, and returned with a clinical efficiency that made her feel more like a guest of the state than a woman in hiding. But draped over the back of the chair was the wool coat Taehyun had given her the night before. It was far too large for her, the sleeves long and the shoulders broad, smelling faintly of the expensive, cedar-scented tobacco that seemed to cling to him. She pulled it on over her shoulders, the weight of it grounding her, a physical anchor in a world that felt increasingly untethered from reality. She wandered out into the hallway, her footsteps swallowed by the deep pile of the carpet. The house was a labyrinth of safe and completely unfamiliar spaces. Every corner she turned revealed another piece of cold, magnificent art or a security camera that blinked with a rhythmic, judgmental red eye. She found herself in a sprawling sunroom that felt like a glass cage suspended over the valley. At a long, minimalist table, Minyu was already seated, scrolling through a tablet while a steam rose from a porcelain cup. He looked up, his expression softening into that same look of cautious curiosity he'd worn the night before. "You look like you're wearing a suit of armor," he said, nodding toward the oversized coat. Alina tightened the lapels around her. "It's the only thing that feels real right now." She sat across from him, her hands instinctively searching for the familiar shape of her violin case which Minyu had placed on a nearby side table. "Does he always live like this, in a fortress?" "The fortress isn't for him," Minyu replied, setting the tablet aside. "It's for the name. Kang isn't just a surname in Seoul, it's a border. Once you're inside it, you're safe, but you're also part of the geography. Taehyun hasn't left these walls without a security detail since he was 19. I think he's forgotten that most people don't need a perimeter to sleep at night." Alina looked out at the stone walls that circled the property. "He said I was a vulnerability. Why? I'm just a musician with a dead father and a debt I can't pay. Why would a man like the leader of the Lee Syndicate care about me?" Minyu hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the security cameras before returning to hers. "Because Taehyun looked at you. In our world, interest is an invitation to war. If the Lee Syndicate thinks there is something, or someone, that can make Kang Taehyun lose his focus, they will burn the city down to get to it. You aren't just Alina Brooks here. You're the first thing he's reached for in a decade that didn't have a tactical purpose." The weight of the coat felt heavier then, a mantle of responsibility she hadn't asked for. She felt like a figure in one of the abstract paintings on the walls, distorted, repositioned, and viewed only through the lens of someone else's perspective. As if summoned by the mention of his name, the heavy doors at the end of the hall swung open. Taehyun entered, his presence immediately shifting the atmospheric pressure of the room. He was dressed in a charcoal suit, his hair slicked back, the tattoo on his neck a dark promise against the stark white of his collar. He didn't look at Minyu. His eyes went straight to Alina, tracing the line of the coat where it draped over her small frame. He stopped at the head of the table, his hands resting on the back of a chair. He didn't ask how she slept. He didn't offer a morning greeting. He simply looked at her with an intensity that made the vast room feel suddenly very small. "The violin," he said, his voice a low, commanding baritone. "Minyu tells me you haven't touched it since you arrived." "It's hard to play when you feel like you're in a museum," Alina said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Music requires air. It requires a world to breathe in." Taehyun stepped closer, the sharp scent of his cologne cutting through the morning air. He looked at the instrument case, then back at her. For a split second, the cold mask of the syndicate leader slipped, and Alina saw the man from the rain, the one who had tightened his hand around nothing because he didn't know how to ask for what he wanted. "You have the air," he said quietly. "You have the silence. This house is built to keep the world out, Alina. Use that." He turned to leave but stopped, his hand lingering on the doorframe. He didn't look back, but his voice carried a strange, unmanaged weight. "Keep the coat. You look less like you're running when you're wearing it." He disappeared back into the shadows of the estate, leaving Alina alone with the silence and the violin. She reached out, her fingers brushing the worn leather of the case. The house was safe, and it was beautiful, but as she looked at her reflection in the glass, she realized she was no longer sure where the protection ended and the prisoner began. She was a woman in a dead man's past and a dangerous man's coat, waiting for the music to tell her which one she was supposed to be. The sunroom became Alina's fortress within a fortress, a glass-walled island where the only sounds were the distant, muffled calls of security teams and the occasional sharp cry of a hawk circling the mountain. She sat by the window, the violin resting against her collarbone, but she didn't play. Her bow hovered inches above the strings, paralyzed by the sheer, clinical weight of the silence. The door opened with a soft, melodic chime, and Minyu stepped inside. He wasn't wearing the sharp, restrictive suits the rest of the household favored. Instead, he wore a soft cashmere sweater that made him look like a college student rather than the second-in-command of a criminal dynasty. He carried a tray with 2 small bowls of steaming jjiggy and a plate of sliced fruit. "The chef says you haven't eaten more than a few bites of toast in 2 days, Minyu said, setting the tray down with a practiced, easy grace. "In this house, hunger is considered a security flaw. It makes you slow." Alina finally lowered her bow, a faint, weary smile touching her lips. "Is everything here measured in terms of security?" Minyu pulled up a chair, sitting with a relaxed posture that stood in stark contrast to his brother's rigid vertical presence. "When you grow up with the name Kang, you learn to see the world as a series of defensive perimeters. But," he added, sliding a bowl toward her, "even soldiers need to eat. This is my mother's recipe. It's the only thing in this house that doesn't taste like it was prepared by a nutritionist." Alina took a cautious spoonful. The heat was immediate and grounding, a sharp, spicy contrast to the cold marble of the estate. As she ate, she watched Minyu. He lacked the winter-cold intensity that defined Taehyun, but there was a quiet sharpness in his eyes, a different kind of strength that came from observing rather than commanding. "You're very different from him," Alina remarked, gesturing toward the door where Taehyun usually appeared. "Taehyun had to be the wall," Minyu said simply, his voice losing its playful edge for a second. "When our father died, the syndicate was like a house with the windows blown out. Taehyun was 19. He didn't have the luxury of being alarming or kind. He had to be iron. If he showed a single crack, the Lee syndicate would have poured through it." He looked at Alina, his expression turning thoughtful. "That's why you're such a problem for him, Alina. You aren't a threat he can shoot or a contract he can sign. You're the first thing he's ever seen that he can't categorize." "I'm just a violinist," she whispered, her fingers tracing the F-holes of her instrument. "To the rest of the world, maybe," Minyu countered. "But to him, you're the woman who made him stop a war council because he couldn't stop thinking about the way you looked in the rain. I've known him my whole life, and I've never seen him look at a photograph, let alone a person, the way he looks at you. It's like he's trying to remember a language he never learned." Minyu reached into the pocket of his sweater and pulled out a small, old wooden bridge for a violin, a spare part, polished and smooth. "I found this in the music room downstairs. Taehyun used to spend hours in there when he was a kid, listening to records. He never learned to play, but he has a perfect ear for pitch. He can tell if a note is off from 3 rooms away." Alina took the small piece of wood, her thumb rubbing over the grain. The idea of the dangerous, tattooed man she had met in the rain sitting in a quiet room listening to classical music felt like a bridge to a person she hadn't yet met. It made the unfamiliar coat she was still wearing feel a little more like a gift and a little less like a uniform. "He isn't going to hurt you, Alina," Minyu said, his voice dropping to a low, sincere register. "He doesn't know how to be soft, but he knows how to be certain. If he says you're safe here, then the entire weight of the Kang name is standing between you and the world." For the first time since she had arrived in Seoul, Alina felt the tension in her shoulders begin to give way. Trust was a dangerous thing in a house built on secrets, but as she looked at Minu's less alarming smile, she realized that she wasn't just a prisoner or a guest. She was a witness to a transformation that was already happening, one silent minute at a time. "Play something," Minu encouraged, nodding toward the violin. "Not for a contract, not for your father's debt, just for the house. It's been too quiet here for a long time." Alina nodded, lifted the bow, and drew a single, long note across the strings. It was a low, mournful sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, reaching into the shadows of the hallway where a man in a charcoal suit stood perfectly still, listening to the music he had never been able to make himself. In that moment, the estate felt a little less like a fortress and a little more like a home, and Alina Brooks realized that she was no longer just running. She was finally beginning to listen. The afternoon light had begun to fail, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor of Alina's suite. The estate was breathing, a low, rhythmic thrum of distant ventilation, and the occasional soft footfall of a guard in the corridor. But inside her room, the air felt thick with the ghosts of things left behind. Alina sat on the edge of the bed, the old leather trunk she had inherited from her father resting between her feet. It was a battered thing, scarred by decades of travel, smelling of cedar, old paper, and the faint, lingering scent of the pipe tobacco he had favored. She had avoided opening it since her arrival, terrified that the contents would anchor her too deeply to a past she was trying to outrun. But Minu's words about the name being a border had stayed with her. If she was to live within the shadow of the Kang dynasty, she needed to understand why her father's life had been so inextricably linked to it. Her fingers trembled as she unlatched the rusted brass buckles. Inside were the fragments of a man she realized she barely knew, weathered sheet music, a collection of vintage fountain pens, and tucked into a hidden compartment in the lining, a small black ledger. The cover was cracked. The year 1995 embossed in fatting gold on the spine. As she turned the pages, the entries were sparse at first: travel dates, currency conversions, and notes on acoustics in various Seoul concert halls. But as she moved deeper into the summer of that year, the handwriting shifted. It became hurried, the ink bleeding into the paper as if written with a frantic hand. July 14th. The contact in Gangnam is not what I expected. Young, but with eyes that have seen the end of the world. He calls himself Kang. He doesn't want the music. He wants the silence that follows it. He says a man in his position cannot afford to listen to anything else. Alina's breath hitched. She flipped the page, her eyes scanning the entries until she found a folded slip of paper tucked between the leaves. It was a receipt from a private bank, dated October 1995, detailing a transfer of funds that was staggering for a man who had lived his life as a wandering musician. At the bottom, in her father's elegant script, were 3 words that made the room feel suddenly, dangerously cold: the blood debt. The journal detailed a secret history. Her father hadn't just been a musician in Seoul. He had been a confidant, a man who moved through the high society circles of the city with a violin in his hand and a ledger in his pocket. He had served as a neutral bridge between the rising Kang patriarch and the world outside the syndicate. But the entries ended abruptly in November with a final, chilling note: "I have seen too much of the fractured light. If I leave now, I leave with the secret. If I stay, I become part of the shadow. For Alina's sake, I choose the exit." The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her father hadn't just been running from grief or bad investments. He had been running from the very men who were now keeping her safe. The debt she thought she was here to settle wasn't financial. It was a legacy of silence that had finally caught up to her. A soft click at the door made her jump, nearly dropping the ledger. Taehyun stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. He didn't enter, he simply stood. There, his gaze moving from her face to the open trunk, and finally to the black book in her lap. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, turning sharp and operational. "You're digging into things that have been buried for a long time," he said, his voice a low, warning rumble. "My father wasn't just a guest in the city, was he?" Alina asked, her voice shaking but her eyes defiant. She held up the ledger, the cracked leather catching the fading light. He knew your father. He knew about the 1995 transition. This blood debt. It wasn't his, was it? It was yours. Taehyun stepped into the room then, his presence filling the space until the air seemed to vibrate with the sheer weight of his history. He stopped a few feet from her, his hands clasped behind his back, the tattoo on his neck appearing like a dark, intricate map of the world he had inherited. 1995 was the year the dynasty was forged in fire, Taehyun said, his eyes never leaving hers. Your father was the only man who saw my father's face when he wasn't wearing the mask of a king. He was the one who helped him move the assets that built these walls. He was a friend, Alina, a luxury my father couldn't afford to keep. So you brought me here because of him, she whispered. Because of a 30-year-old secret. Taehyun looked at her, and for a fleeting second the cold, calculating leader disappeared. In his place was the man who had frozen for 4 minutes over a single photograph. I brought you here because you were standing in the rain with a name you didn't understand. I brought you here because the Lee Syndicate knows what that ledger contains, even if you didn't. He reached out, his hand hovering over the trunk before he pulled it back, as if afraid the mere contact would shatter the fragile piece they had built. The debt isn't something you owe me, Alina. It's something I owe you. For 30 years your father kept our secrets. Now it is my turn to keep you. He turned to leave but paused at the threshold, the unfamiliar coat she still wore casting a long shadow against the wall. Don't look for any more ghosts tonight. The living are dangerous enough. The door closed with a finality that felt like a seal. Alina sat in the gathering dark, the ledger of 1995 heavy in her hands. The safe, unfamiliar estate had just become a place of profound consequence. She wasn't just a violinist anymore. She was the curator of a history that could dismantle an empire, and the man who was protecting her was the very person whose legacy was written in the blood-red ink of her father's past. She realized then that she had stopped running, but she had run straight into the heart of the storm. The mansion felt larger after the revelation of the ledger, its hallways echoing with the weight of 30 years of secrets. Alina found herself wandering the lower levels, drawn by a pull she couldn't explain toward the one-room menu had mentioned, the music room. It was tucked away in a wing of the estate that felt abandoned by the syndicate's cold efficiency, a place where the air was still and smelled of aged lemon oil and old paper. The room was vast, circular, and lined with thousands of vinyl records and pristine scores. In the center sat a grand piano, its black surface reflecting the moonlight like a dark, still pool. As Alina stepped inside, her hand brushed against a small, modern filing cabinet near the stereo system. A stray document was tucked into a folder labeled Philanthropic Allocations, International. Her breath hitched as she saw the header. It was the letterhead of the Brooklyn Conservatory, the very school where she had taught and studied, the one that had been on the verge of bankruptcy for years, until a mysterious, overseas benefactor had stepped in to clear its debts and establish a permanent scholarship in her father's name. She scanned the bank routing numbers, her eyes widening as she recognized the same shell company codes she had seen in her father's ledger of 1995. The anonymous donor who had saved her life's work, the one who had kept the lights on in the only place she ever felt at home, wasn't a faceless corporation. It was the man who had ordered her brought to him. You weren't supposed to find that. Taehyun's voice came from the shadows of the doorway. He wasn't wearing his jacket. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing the intricate dark ink that wrapped around his forearms like armor. He looked tired, the sharp edge of his authority softened by the dim, amber light of the room. Why? Alina asked, the paper trembling in her hand. You've been paying for my school, for my father's legacy, for years. You didn't even know me then. Taehyun walked toward the piano, his fingers trailing over the keys without pressing them. I knew the man your father was. I knew what this city took from him. I couldn't give him back the years he spent running, but I could make sure the thing he loved most, the music, survived. He finally looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. I didn't do it for you to find out. I did it because it was the only thing in my world that felt clean. The realization hit her with more force than the rain in Gangnam. He wasn't just her protector, he had been her silent patron, a man who lived in a world of violence but spent his fortune protecting the sublime. Alina moved to the center of the room and picked up her violin, which she had begun carrying with her like a talisman. The silence in the room was expectant, heavy with the things Taehyun couldn't say. "Let me play for you," she whispered. "Not for a contract, not for the debt, just for you." Taehyun sat on a leather bench, his posture losing its rigid, defensive line. Alina tucked the violin under her chin and drew the bow. She didn't play a masterpiece or a complex concerto. She played a simple, mournful melody her father used to hum when he thought she wasn't listening. The music filled the circular room, vibrating through the wood and the glass, weaving through the shadows. As she played, she watched Taehyun. His eyes closed, and for the first time, the precision and fear that defined him seemed to dissolve. In the flicker of the candlelight, he didn't look like a mafia boss or a king of a criminal dynasty. He looked like the boy who used to sit in this room listening to records, trying to find a world that didn't hurt. When the last note faded into the silence, Taehyun didn't move for a long time. The air between them had shifted from the cold tension of a captor and captive to something fragile and dangerously real. "My father used to say that music is the only thing that tells the truth when everyone else is lying," Alina said softly. Taehyun stood up, crossing the distance between them until he was standing just inches away. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before his thumb finally, tentatively, brushed a stray hair from her forehead. His touch was warm, surprisingly gentle, and lacked any of the dominant control he showed the world. "Then the truth is," Taehyun murmured, his voice a low, rough caress, "that I've been listening to you for a long time, Alina, long before I saw you in the rain." In that private performance, the walls of the estate didn't feel like a prison anymore. They felt like a sanctuary. Alina looked up at the man who had been her silent guardian from across an ocean, and she realized that the unfamiliar coat she wore was more than just a shield. It was an invitation into the heart of a man who had forgotten he had won. The storm was still raging outside the gates, but for the first time, the music inside was louder. The engine of the black sedan was a low, rhythmic hum as it climbed the winding spine of Namsan Mountain, moving away from the suffocating luxury of the estate and toward the sky. Inside the car, the air was different, less like a vault and more like a shared breath. Taehyun sat beside Alina, his hand resting near hers on the leather seat, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. He had discarded his tie, and the top buttons of his shirt were undone, making him look less like a monarch and more like a man who was simply tired of carrying the world on his shoulders. They pulled into a private overlook, a jagged ledge of granite that bit into the night air. The city of Seoul lay below them, a sprawling tapestry of fractured light and electric gold, so vast it seemed to hum with its own heartbeat. "Get out," Taehyun said softly. It wasn't a command this time, it was an invitation. Alina stepped out into the crisp mountain air, the unfamiliar coat still draped over her shoulders. The wind here was fierce, tugging at her hair and smelling of pine and distant rain. Taehyun walked to the edge of the stone parapet, leaning his weight against it as he looked out over his kingdom. Here, without the security cameras or the watchful eyes of his soldiers, he looked smaller, more human. "I come here when the silence in the house gets too loud," he said, his voice barely rising above the wind. "Down there, everyone is a number or a threat. Up here, they're just lights. It's easier to breathe when you don't have to decide who lives and who dies in the next hour." Alina walked up beside him, her shoulder brushing his arm. The contact was electric, an unguarded, unmanaged connection that didn't belong in their world of ledgers and blood. She looked at his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the dark, intricate ink of the tattoo on his neck that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the city. "You don't have to be the wall tonight, Taehyun," she whispered. He turned to her then, his dark eyes reflecting the sea of lights below. For the first time, he didn't look away. He didn't mask the longing that had been visible in that first surveillance photograph. He reached out, his hand sliding into her hair, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek with a tenderness that made her heart skip. "I've spent 15 years building a fortress to protect a name I never wanted," he murmured, his voice a low, rough confession. And then I saw you crying in the rain, and I realized that the fortress was just a cage. You didn't just bring the music back into the house, Alina. You brought the air. Alina reached up, her fingers covering his hand, pressing it against her face. I spent my life running because I was afraid of being seen. I thought if I moved fast enough, the grief wouldn't catch me. But here with you, for the first time, I want to stand still. The moment hung between them, fragile as a glass ornament. In the distance, the city lights flickered, but for a heartbeat, the rest of the world ceased to exist. There were no syndicates, no debts, and no ghosts of 1995. There was only the warmth of his hand and the scent of rain on the wind. Taehyun leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. It wasn't a kiss, not yet, but it was an admission. It was the choice he was making on the mountain, to choose the woman over the empire, the heart over the strategy. They will come for us, he warned, his voice a ghost of his usual authority. The Lee Syndicate, the ghosts of our fathers. They won't let a vulnerability like this go unpunished. Then let them come, Alina replied, her voice steady and certain. I'm not running anymore. Taehyun looked at her, a strange, rare light moving across his face, the ghost of a smile that was more earned than any victory he had ever won. He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, quiet and certain. It was a decision that had already been made, now simply being acknowledged out loud. On that mountain overlook, amidst the fractured light of Seoul, the Mafia boss who swore he'd never fall in love finally stopped fighting the storm and let it take him. The city blazed below them, gold and endless, but for Taehyun and Alina, the only thing that mattered was the quiet, dangerous truth of the hand they were holding. The peace of the mountain was shattered before they even reached the gates of the estate. The radio in the front seat erupted into a jagged burst of static and urgent, clipped Korean, the voice of a man who knew the perimeter had been breached. Taehyun's posture shifted instantly, the softness of the overlook replaced by a terrifying, cold lucidity. He didn't let go of Alina's hand, but his grip changed from a caress to a tether. They're inside, Taehyun said, his voice a low, vibrating blade. As the sedan surged forward, tires screaming against the asphalt, the night became a blur of tactical motion. The Lee Syndicate hadn't just moved. They had struck with the desperation of a predator that knew its window was closing. Black smoke rolled over the high stone walls of the Kang estate, and the rhythmic pop of distant gunfire echoed through the pines. When the car skidded to a halt in the courtyard, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Minyu was there, a smudge of soot on his cashmere sweater, his face pale but determined as he directed the retreat of the household staff toward the reinforced basement. Taehyun, the east wing is compromised, Minyu shouted over the roar of a secondary explosion. They're looking for the ledger, they're looking for her. Taehyun turned to Alina, his eyes dark with a fierce, protective light. He gripped her shoulders, his thumbs pressing into the unfamiliar coat that still draped her frame. Go with Minyu. The bunker is pressurized and deep. They won't get to you there. I'll end this and come for you. But Alina didn't move toward the safety of the stairs. She looked at the fire reflecting in Taehyun's eyes, then at the violin case slung over her shoulder, and finally at the man who had spent his life being a wall for everyone else. No, she said, her voice small but unbreakable. Alina, this isn't a performance. This is a war, Taehyun hissed, his hand moving to the holster at his hip. Go, now. You told me that in this house the name is a border, Alina countered, stepping closer into his space, refusing to let the chaos outside drown her out. You said I was part of the geography now. If I go down into that hole, I'm just a ghost again. I'm just a piece of history you're hiding. If you're going to fight for this legacy, for the truth in that ledger, then let me stand where I can see it. Taehyun froze. For the first time, he wasn't looking at a vulnerability to be managed. He was looking at a partner. The Lee Syndicate wanted Alina because they thought she was the leash they could pull to make the Mafia boss kneel. They didn't understand that she was the heartbeat that made him stand taller. It's not safe, Alina, he murmured, a rare tremor of fear for someone other than himself touching his voice. Nowhere is safe, she replied, reaching out to touch the dark ink on his neck, her fingers steady against the heat of his skin. But I'd rather be in the storm with you than waiting for the silence after it's over. Taehyun looked at Minyu, who gave a sharp, grim nod of understanding. The younger brother stepped back, signaling the remaining guards to form a tight, moving perimeter around the two of them. Taehyun didn't argue further. He reached out and pulled Alina flush against his side, his arm a solid, unyielding bar of iron around her waist. "Stay behind me," he commanded, his voice regaining its absolute, terrifying certainty. "Don't look at the fractured light, just look at me." They moved through the smoke-filled corridors of the estate, a surreal procession of violence and elegance. Alina felt the recoil of the world around her, the heavy thud of doors being breached, the shouting in the gardens, the cold precision of Taehyun's commands as he coordinated the defense through his earpiece. She was terrified. Her heart a frantic bird against her ribs, but she didn't flinch. She stayed anchored to him, her hand tucked into the fold of his shirt, a silent witness to the price of the name she now shared. In the grand foyer, where the glass walls met the obsidian floor, the final confrontation began to bleed through. Taehyun stood in the center of the room, a king guarding his throne, with Alina at his back. The Lee Syndicate's men were shadows at the edge of the firelight, but they hesitated. They had come for a victim, a girl they could use to break a man. Instead, they found a man who had finally found something worth the blood on his hands, and a woman who refused to be the reason he fell. The price of a name was high, written in the smoke of the burning East Wing and the spent shells on the marble. But as Taehyun turned his head slightly to catch Alina's gaze in the mirror-like glass, he didn't see a liability. He saw the only truth he had ever known. The crisis wasn't over, but the fear was. Alina Brooks had stopped running, and in doing so, she had given the Mafia boss the only weapon the Lee Syndicate couldn't counter, a reason to win that had nothing to do with power, and everything to do with the woman standing in the center of the storm. The smoke from the night's confrontation had begun to thin, drifting over the mountains like the remnants of a fatting ghost. The estate was quiet again, not the suffocating, clinical silence of a fortress, but the heavy, exhausted stillness that follows a storm. Taehyun led Alina through the shadowed corridors of the upper floor, his hand never leaving hers, until they reached a heavy steel door that opened onto the rooftop. The air up here was biting and clean, stripped of the scent of gunpowder and burning cedar. Below them, Seoul was beginning to wake. The fractured light of the neon signs was giving way to the first pale, bruised violet of dawn. The city looked different from this height, less like a battlefield and more like a promise. Taehyun walked to the very edge of the roof, where the glass railing met the sky. He stopped, his shoulders finally dropping as he exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding since that first Thursday evening. He turned to Alina, and for the first time since they had met in the rain, he looked at her without a single barrier between them. No desk, no security cameras, no unfamiliar coat acting as a shield. Just him and the woman who had refused to leave his side. "You're still wearing it," he said softly, his gaze tracing the wool coat that draped over her shoulders. Alina looked down at the dark fabric, then back at him. She reached up and slowly unbuttoned it, letting the heavy garment slide off her shoulders and pool at her feet. She stood before him in the simple white dress from that first night, now stained with soot and rain, her violin case gripped in her left hand. "I don't think I need the armor anymore," she whispered. Taehyun stepped toward her, the distance between them vanishing. He reached out, his hand sliding behind her neck, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a slow, deliberate certainty. He wasn't looking at her as a vulnerability or a debt to be settled. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, without the bow, without the lens of her father's past, and without the fear that had defined her life for so long. "You told me that you use your music as a wall," Taehyun murmured, his voice a low, rough vibration in the morning air. "But tonight I didn't see a wall. I saw someone who stood in the center of a fire and didn't burn. I spent my life thinking that if I just kept moving, I'd eventually find a place where the air was clear," Alina said, her voice steady against the wind. "I thought Seoul was just another stop, another 3-week contract, an exit." She reached up, her fingers intertwining with his, pressing his palm against her cheek. "But I realized tonight that the only reason I was running was because I hadn't found anything worth staying for." Taehyun leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his eyes closing as he pulled her flush against him. The precision and fear that had governed his world for 15 years didn't exist here on this rooftop, above the empire he had built. There was only the heat of her skin and the frantic, beautiful rhythm of a heart that was no longer trying to escape. The flight back to New York is in 4 hours, Taehyun reminded her, though he didn't pull away. Alina looked out over the gold and endless expanse of the city, then back at the man who had been her silent guardian before he ever knew her name. Indefinite extension, she said, the words a quiet vow. The story isn't finished yet. A ghost of a smile, something rare, earned, and entirely unmanaged, moved across Taehyun's face. He didn't make a grand gesture. He simply took her hand, his fingers locking with hers in a way that felt like a decision already made and finally acknowledged out loud. He reached out and took the violin case from her, setting it carefully on a stone bench, the way one sets down something fragile but no longer broken. Then he looked at her again, his dark eyes reflecting the rising sun. "I don't know how to be the man you deserve," he confessed, the honesty of it raw and jagged. "I only know how to be the man who keeps you." "Then start there," Alina replied. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the old photograph of their fathers from 1995. For a moment she held it up to the light, then she slowly let it go. The wind caught the paper, spinning it away into the abyss of the city below, letting the ghosts of the past finally find their rest. Taehyun watched it fall, then turned back to her, his grip on her hand tightening. He didn't say stay. He didn't have to. The silence between them was no longer a cage, it was a conversation. As the sun finally broke over the horizon, painting the obsidian estate in shades of fire and gold, the Mafia boss who swore he'd never fall in love leaned down and finally closed the distance between them. The kiss was like the rain in Gangnam, sudden, overwhelming, and life-changing. The city blazed below them, a world of fractured light and shadow, but for the first time in either of their lives, they weren't looking at the exit. They were looking at each other, and for Alina Brooks, the running was finally over. The music was just beginning.